Ah. Oh, he's left his juice, Simmons.
Oh, this is a long and winding tale about my childhood, and the first superhero experience I ever had, I probably can't even pin down. I watched Batman animated series growing up. I had that on VHS, and then naturally, I kind of just somehow picked up the Batman Gotham Adventures comic, which was a tie-in to BTAS. I always enjoyed reading that, and then gradually, as I started getting older, I found encountering comics in all different ways. I'm sure you'll remember that. Our American audience won't get this, but at the Co-op and in W.H. Smith and stuff.
W.H. Smith?
Yes, we had Panini, and what they did was they collected different ongoings, but like months after they'd already initialed out in floppy form, and then they put them in these different issues that would be compilations of different comics. And I remember picking up stuff for X-Men and even bits and bobs of Hush when that was releasing, which was really weird. And the first actual comic that I remember picking up in floppy form was Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man. And that was amazing to me because that was obviously the retelling of the character's origin, but it was also so modern and so fresh, and that really, really got me interested. Along the years, I'd pick up some different comics. I was fortunate enough to have my mum, who is this amazing comic book fan. She shared with me so many different classic issues from the Silver Age with Justice League, and I was privileged enough to read and destroy some of those old prestigious comics because I was a child and I was there going "Ah!" and tearing them apart and stuff, which is really bad. I'm going to hell, but whatever. And then The Dark Knight came out, and at this point I kind of more in the filmic side of where I was kind of in my interests growing up. And then I was around about 12 at the time, if you need to know. And then The Dark Knight came out, I was completely blown away, as we all were, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna get into comics. I'm really going to get into comics. I went on YouTube back then and YouTubed all these different, some of the top 10 Batman graphic novels or comics, whatever.
Oh,
and
this
then
resonated so much.
yeah,
I did the same thing.
yeah, and basically I ended up coming across these different things. I picked them up in bulk. I picked up Year One, I picked up The Dark Knight Returns, and I picked up Batman The Long Halloween, and I read them all back to back, but the one that really stood out for me was The Long Halloween. I mean, I'm not really a big fan of Jeff Loeb's storytelling, but I thought the mystery he told in that story, combined with the gothic, moody, atmospheric pencils of Tim Sale's art, was incredible. And obviously The Dark Knight takes so many elements from The Long Halloween anyway, so I could kind of make the parallels there. But that combined with the previous education I had with BTAS and all those different comics growing up, it was just it just all triggered just a catalyst, and that was what just sent me diving deep. I ended up getting after that Christmas, I remember picking up loads of stuff for Daredevil, loads of stuff for Captain America, and then basically that's where it all went off. I got loads of Batman stuff, which was thankfully, that was around the same time that Morrison was doing Batman R.I.P., so I ended up jumping on that at the time. I was lucky enough where I was growing up to have a comic book shop that was in an old marketplace, so I could go there and talk to this owner who was always happy to give me recommendations. And yeah, just kept on reading, and it's always come in really intense bursts until the point where kind of I got back to uni, and I kind of got sold off from the New 52, and I really didn't collect comics that much. And then I got back to uni and I just started reading again and again. But yeah, it's hard. It's a really difficult question because if I was to say the story that got me, that made me fall in love with comics, it would be the countless episodes I saw growing up when I was a child, and the stories that my mum told me of how much she loved reading comics. But if it was specifically the story that got me into collecting comics like a big old nerd, it would be The Long Halloween, because it's great.
It is great.
Yeah.
It really is good.
Yeah.
I've gone for a very sentimental pick today, because that's all I'm good for, really. Basically, I wanted to use the one that the first proper, I've called it a graphic novel, I don't think that's fair. It's more just a collection of a run from the Amazing Spider-Man series in '99. I think it was volume 2, I want to say. It was called Coming Home, and it was basically the first time I had physically gone out and had a comic. First time I got out in the world. The sun was bright, the sky was blue, all of that. But yeah, first time I actually went to Forbidden Planet with my dad. And he was like, look, we'll let you buy a one of your own. Because up to that point, I'd been reading them from car boot sales and stuff, just the odd issue here. So none of it really made any sense. So this was the first proper Adam Nicholas buys a comic that he can read from start to finish, like a run of stuff, and he's going to enjoy. So it was coming home, and basically, obviously, the story centers around Peter Parker dealing with the whole process of who is he, and like it's kind of post Spider-Man career a bit. He's juggling two lives between trying to be a teacher and trying to find value in being Peter Parker while also trying to be Spider-Man. And then you get this, I remember, this is why I remember it so vividly and why I loved it so much, was because at the time, I had no previous on any of the other characters who came into the story. I'd been watching the animated series a bit, so I knew the villains, like, you know, Scorpions of the world, the Chameleons, Dr. Octopus, all those kind of guys. But this was something completely new. So Spidey meets a guy called Ezekiel, who's this rich billionaire, and he's like got these powers that are very similar to Spider-Man's. And turns out to try to like rewrite the narrative of basically where the powers kind of come from. Up till this point, it's kind of been bug bites him on the hand, but it was more like something was passing on these powers from a bit more of a spiritual place. Woo! Like they talk about the totems, spider totems and all this. And basically, the combination of these two being together ends up drawing out, Ezekiel tells Spider-Man about these other guys who are going to come and try to take the powers. That we get introduced to the Morlun, who's a character who I'd never ever seen before. And Morlun just spends the whole thing kicking Spider-Man's ass. So I'm like, this is what? He's getting beat up. What's he going to do? But what did he do, Ewan? Yeah, he's smart. Peter Parker's a smart boy and realizes that for all the power Spider-Man has, he can't beat Morlun. So like the story is basically, the strength is in Peter Parker's mind and is like being cleverer than Morlun. And obviously, I won't spoil it for anybody who hasn't read it, but basically uses his brain to outwit Morlun and ends up defeating him. But that is, obviously it must have been good because it stayed with me forever. I've never actually read it back since, so I can't tell you if it stands up or not. I think I'm going to. I want to say it was, what's he called? Straczynski, there you go. Yeah. Straczynski's first, I think, proper delve into it, and really just like the way he changed the narrative of everything was just, I really enjoyed that. Like thinking of like, I mean, I say this, I'm looking at it now, I have been back and researched it a little bit, but like the narrative of the fact that to do that in one of his first runs, basically, and try and like rewrite it, but also keep it engaging so that people are interested, was just, it's so bold, but actually even 11-year-old me was like, this is amazing, I'm really excited about this. And since then, I think that was the first one, and since then, obviously, my love of Spider-Man has just grown and grown. It was wonderful, and that was the first comic book I ever properly fell in love with, the first story.
So back in the olden days, when I first got into comics, I didn't really get into comics, I got into comic book characters. So this is many, many eras ago when most of the people here weren't born. And I sort of got into the X-Men because of the animated show, Batman mostly because of the animated series, and then Hellblazer, Dangerous Habits came into my possession. I was immediately taken by it because the cover is still great. Floating heads, scary skulls, all good. And in this comic, I found something that I didn't know comics were. So not only was it an English superhero.
Liverpool represent?
Yeah, obviously not. So all of the comic book heroes were American. It was all Americana. Batman, Spider-Man, very much rooted in where they were from. And then Constantine came along and he was an anti-hero the same way Batman was in Batman Returns, in that he was just very dark, and he was not like, he didn't prescribe to any sort of conventional moral code. And I was very young, I was probably too young to be reading this. It came out in 91, this was probably a couple of years later than that. And it was great. I didn't know that comics could be like this. So it's about death, and it's about dangerous habits of drinking and smoking and basically sticking two fingers up at the devil. And how could you not really love that, no matter what age you are? And if you're a little weirdo who sort of responds to anti-heroes and darkness and things like that, it just sort of like got immediately into me. I still love the story now, and it's almost a shame that it was adapted quite infamously, let's say, in the Keanu Reeves film. But I maintain that film deserves a second look, especially now that there is a Keanu Renaissance. Yeah, Keanu-sance, yeah. And the good things about that film are very much things that came out of the comic. The idea of his mortal soul being condemned and things like that. It's just really good writing in the comic. And I also want to give a shout out to Civil War and Marvel Zombies, because by that point I was a bit of a cynical comic book fan. And if anything like a big story event came along, I'd be like, oh, this is just an excuse to sell loads of comics. Which is fine. That strangely enough now, I'm sort of like, yeah, good. That's a really good thing sometimes. But at the time, Civil War was the first time I read all these satellite comics where all of the individual characters had their own parts leading into one main, and I read absolutely all of them, even when they were coming in the middle of storylines that I wasn't necessarily as invested in. And it just sort of changed how I loved comics for a good decade or so. So there you go.
Well, I was into superheroes long before I was into comics, obviously, from old Batman movies to Spider-Man games, but I was never really into comics. I don't know why, like the mechanics of it, I couldn't quite get my head around, because obviously you have a lot of ongoing series, you have a lot of different types within those series, and for a child like me, I struggled to even get my head around the entire concept. So I would read a lot of comics, but they would be part of an ongoing story, so I wouldn't get a proper satisfying whole. And I just didn't quite understand them, I don't think. I went to car boot sales and bought a lot of older comics, so I jumped into the history, so I kind of had this kind of scattered, disparate knowledge of the medium at large, but wasn't quite able to put it together. And then after I was really into like sort of the movie side of things and the gaming side of things, I thought, you know what, I need to go back to the source and get into comics as just a medium as a whole. So I did what everyone does, and what you did, Ewan, I went to the YouTubes and just typed in, what's the best comic of all time? And do you know what happens when you type in, what's the best comic of all time? Watchmen comes up, of course it does. And this was about 2008, 2009, so the movie was coming out. So I had the trailers for that, which I thought looked really cool. I actually really quite liked Zack Snyder back in the day, and I thought this looked like a sexy, stylish, violent thing, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna go back and read the book before I actually get to the movie. So I rented it from a library that was near mine. But I finally got it. It became this sort of like sacred text. I knew a lot about Alan Moore. I knew a lot about like why it was supposed to be so good. So I sat down reading it as like a 13-year-old or whatever. I opened it up and it was nothing like I expected it to be. It was like dark, it was moody. I just thought it was going to be this kind of like big action extravaganza, but it had like obviously a lot of deep themes that I didn't quite understand as a kid. But what really blew me away and what convinced me that you could tell really good stories was how that subverted like comic book storytelling and superhero storytelling and just regular storytelling sort of as a whole. I'll always remember the first time I got to that Ozymandias page where he's explaining his grand plan to everyone.
30 minutes ago.
Yeah, and he's like, I've already done it. I've already enacted it. Like, there's no stopping it. And I thought, oh my God, this is actually going to go ahead with this monumental like master plan, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences. Because growing up on Saturday morning cartoons, like the heroes in those shows don't have to deal with lasting consequences, but the characters in this did. It felt like it had a proper impact on the story as a whole, and I thought that was just so good. And it's kind of what soured me on later kind of Marvel movies in a way, because they don't, in my opinion, like Phase 2 Marvel movies don't really dwell on the consequences of what happens in those movies. Yet Watchmen, I kept going back to how that was dealt with in Watchmen, and I just thought that was so smart. And even though I didn't have a full grasp on the medium as a whole, I could see how it was subverting those storytelling expectations in such a smart and clever in just like interesting way. And then I was just immersed in the story of Watchmen as a whole. Then the movie came out and I watched that, and I thought it was all right back in the day. I haven't watched it since then, but I want to go back to the original story again and reappraise it as an older adult, because I think there would have been so much stuff from that story that I missed the first time around and that I have a hazy recollection of. So I want to go back, and I'll probably get a whole new appreciation for the medium by going back a few years old, or 10 years old or whatever, and actually seeing it through. So it's that. And then when it comes to ongoing series, Ultimate Spider-Man and The Walking Dead, those were like, right, I can just buy these every week and have such a great time.
This is quite hard to pin down because growing up, comics were always there. Like I was always collecting Spider-Man, or I had friends that were basically my two bays are Spider-Man and Punisher. So, but I don't remember a specific arc from Spidey. So I'm going to go with Welcome Back, Frank, which is when Garth Ennis took over for Punisher back in 2001. Because I was a little bit lapsed from comics in general. I don't know what it was, but whatever. It wasn't as bold as I was when I was first growing up. And it took Ennis's writing to sort of have that kind of like dark, like sardonic, macabre sense of humor, which just perfectly matches Punisher, and was just that sort of his approach to like vigilante justice, and him being very self-aware in terms of the moral degradation of what he's doing to clean up the streets and all that kind of stuff. But the way that Steve Dillon wrote that stuff, or inked that stuff, gave it like a very comic booky, very punchy sensibility, and I like that art style. But yeah, it was Welcome Back, Frank, and then which I ended up picking up because of I think it was because of the movie the 2004 movie, the Thomas Jane one, which is all right.
How old you are.
Yes, it's not that bad. Well, I mean, like that one in 2004, I thought that was all right. I like that bit at the end when he's all, you know, vengeance is an emotional response or whatever the hell he says. And he makes the case for punishment, as the Punisher would. And I like that. So I went back and picked up Welcome Back, Frank. And you get to see that, you know, the big sort of like pop arty approach to him fighting the Russian, or at the very beginning when he just picks this dude up and throws him off the top of a building, or Marnucci, and things that were in the game as well. I like how all that stuff kind of comes full circle, but it was Welcome Back, Frank and Garth Ennis that sort of kickstarted me off to be like, okay, I didn't realize that the comics could have that sort of, I don't know, like mature like approach to storytelling, and that it could be like really biting and witty and reflective of like, I don't know, different social attitudes towards taking the law into your own hands and whatever. And I just loved all that stuff, and I totally recommend everything that Ennis did thereafter, the entire Max run that he did, all the way up until when Matt Fraction came back on in Max 11 or whatever it was. But yeah, it would be Garth Ennis, it would be Punisher, and it would be Welcome Back, Frank.